Hello and welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Kira and I have had celiac disease for over 15 years, and I have been sharing with all of you some of my favorite recipes that I've created for gluten-free sourdough baking. And today I have a recipe for gluten-free sourdough dinner rolls or buns, whatever you would like to use them for. All right, friends, we are going to jump right into it today. I have already gotten out a lot of my materials, as you have already seen. I'm just getting out the last touches, which would be my baking sheets. I'm getting out 2 because, as you will see later in the video, I am making a double batch of these hamburger buns, dinner rolls, whatever you want to use them for. So if you only want to make one batch of this, you will only need one pan that is lined with parchment paper. So I get out my scale, and very similarly to my bread recipe, I'm going to add 330 grams of water. Make sure you are zeroing out your scale before you add anything. You add 20 grams of maple syrup. No, you will not be able to taste the sugary maple syrup flavor in it. It just helps your starter get a little boost. Then you will add 20 grams of olive oil, and the very next thing is going to be psyllium husk. Like I said, this is very similar to my bread recipe. The main difference is that I am adding a few extra spices, and it is how you fold the rolls and bake them that is going to give them the difference compared to a regular loaf of bread. So once you put your 20 grams of psyllium husk, you will whisk it all together. Your psyllium husk is going to turn into more of a gel-like consistency, which is why we do this step first. Once you set this to the side and work on your flour mixture and come back to this, it will be a more gel-like consistency, which will let you know that it is then ready to be added in. If you do not mix this and set it aside first, you will get clumps of psyllium husk in your bread, which is not fun. I get out my KitchenAid stand mixer bowl because this is where I'm going to mix everything together, and I open up my King Arthur's gluten-free 1-to-1 flour. I am not using a ton of different blends, just a simple 1-to-1 flour, and I add 340 grams of flour. You could use your own gluten-free flour blend, but I have used King Arthur for a long time, and it seems to be what produces the best results. I'm then going to add 8 grams of salt to my flour, and after that, I'm going to grab out some of my spices. This is the difference between a typical loaf of bread, is that I am adding garlic powder to this, whereas I do not have garlic powder added to my regular bread loaf. Depending on how much garlic flavor you want to come through, you can add anywhere between 5 and 10 grams of the garlic powder, followed by 5 grams of baking powder. Give this all a good mix. If you have a whisk, you can get out your second whisk to mix it all together. I only have one whisk, so I just use a spoon and mix it all up. Then you are ready to add your sourdough, which is my favorite part. I am making this with an active sourdough starter. So you can see this sourdough has a nice bubbly consistency to it, a nice sour smell, and it is ready to bake with. Scrape down all of the sides and give it a little mix so that way you are incorporating everything together before adding it in. And just like the bread recipe, you are going to add 265 grams of sourdough starter. Now be cautious whenever you are scraping things down or putting things into your sourdough starter like this measuring cup. You want to be sure that you don't put anything into your starter other than utensils that have only touched the flour. So I've touched the flour and I've put it in here. But if I use that other spatula to mix up this mixture that has baking powder and salt and other things in it, you need to be very careful to not put that back into your starter because that could cause some damage to a healthy sourdough starter. So as you can see, I'm using this spatula again, but I have not used it for anything outside of mixing up my starter. I then scrape all of my sides down again and put the starter into my fridge until I'm ready to feed it and use it again, or to pull it out and use the discard for something like pancakes. At this point, I'm going to add another 45 grams of water to that sourdough and flour mixture. And then I will grab the psyllium husk mixture, which has now turned into more of a gel-like consistency. As you can see here, it has thickened up, but it is still able to be moved around, and dump that right in with the rest of your mixture. I then move on to my stand mixer, which has the dough hook attachment on it. I do not recommend trying to mix this by hand as it needs to be very well incorporated. You can try doing it by hand, but you might be kneading for a very, very long time. I typically start with my stand mixer on a slower speed so that I don't have flour flying everywhere. And then once it has been a little bit incorporated and the flour is a little bit wet so that it is not going to fly out of the bowl, I will take my bowl off, scrape down all of my sides to make sure that all of the flour is getting incorporated, and then I will turn my mixer up to a medium or high speed. Here you can see the flour is stuck to some of the sides, but it can be much more incorporated, so I scrape it off, scrape it all down into the bottom, and then put it back on to start mixing again. At that point, the water and the liquids in this will be incorporated enough that you should not have to be concerned with flour flying out, so turning it on a higher speed is not going to be a problem. This will usually take a good 3 to 5 minutes to get fully incorporated. You don't need to over mix it, but you do want to make sure that there is no flour left sitting in the bottom of the bowl or any flour left on the sides of it. You can tell when it's done because it will start to form almost like a ball inside of your KitchenAid mixer. Then you will scrape it down, pull out the KitchenAid mixture, and get out some oil. Here is where the difference sets in between the bread loaf and the buns. This is where things get a little different for everyone. We all have put approximately the same amount of ingredients in, but our exact grams is going to differ ever so slightly. So I put my KitchenAid back onto my kitchen scale, zero it out, and I weigh how much my dough is in grams, and then I divide that by 6 because this recipe will give you 6 nice sized rolls or buns. As you can see, the dough should be a little bit sticky, but not so sticky that it is all completely stuck to your hands. To help with this, I typically keep my oil nearby, oil up my hands, and things will not stick at all. You want to zero out your scale and start to weigh your rolls so that you get that nice even size. So I will grab a little bit more or take a little bit away if necessary, and then you go into forming the roll or the bun. I do this by flattening it out, not super thin like a pancake, but thin enough that you can fold all of the sides over. So flatten it out, fold all of the sides in, and when you turn it over, you should have a nice little ball. You don't want to mess with it too much or it will become flat and not keep its shape. I will then do this with the next one and repeat until you have 6 rolls all together. So flatten it out, not as thin as a pancake, but so that you can fold the sides in, fold all of the sides in, and as you can see, it is not becoming overly stuck to my fingers, so I can still work with it. Make it into a nice little ball and sit it on your parchment paper. At this point, it will be very obvious to you if your dough is the correct consistency. If it has too much flour that has not been incorporated properly, you will be picking up clumps of flour, or if it has too much water, it will be so wet and sticky that you will not be able to manipulate it to turn it into the buns and rolls. If you are interested in making more than 6 of these buns, you can easily double this recipe, but as you will see, I wanted to make 2 different types of buns, so that is why I did 2 separate batches. These ones I put the garlic powder in and topped them with sesame seeds. The dough should be able to have the sesame seeds stick to it because of the olive oil that was on your hands. To help them stay in place though, I will ever so slightly pat them into their places. As you'll see, the rolls should hold their shape fairly well. They should not be so wet and runny that they just look like blobs on the tray. They should stay and hold their form very nicely. After topping the buns with sesame seed, I'm moving on to covering them, which is one of the more intricate steps in this process. Before we sit the buns to rest, we are going to cover them with the aluminum foil that they will be baked with, but the key is that this foil should not be touching the buns. I usually do this by folding both of the sides in a little bit to start and then placing the foil over top of the tray because this will make them into sort of like a tent. I then tuck 3 of the edges under here and put my hand inside of it and poke the aluminum foil up a little bit to make sure that it is not touching any of the buns on the inside. If you wrap it snug on the sides, it should not collapse whenever you're baking it. Here you can see that the buns have plenty of room to expand inside and the foil is not touching them. On the other side, I similarly tuck the edges a little bit to make it into more of a tent and then place it over top. This side can be more difficult because you cannot put your hand inside of it to make sure that it is not collapsing down and touching the buns. So I tend to grab a nearby spoon or a spatula, anything that has a long handle. And because there's 2 separate pieces of foil, if you poke the handle into it, you can push up on the inside and that will make it so that it lifts up the foil and is not collapsing down on top of your buns. Then you are guaranteed that your buns are sitting in this nice little tent. Like I mentioned earlier, instead of doubling my recipe for this batch, I made 2 separate batches because one I wanted to have heavier on the garlic powder, and this one I am using a special local made dill seasoning. I put a bunch of dill into it, mixed it all up, and I'm doing the exact same thing as I did with the other one. I add my sourdough, I add my extra water and the psyllium husk back into it, and then I put it all to mix. If garlic isn't your thing or dill isn't your thing and you'd like to choose another flavor, you can just substitute out what I had put in for whatever seasoning you would prefer. Here is a video again showing you what it looks like when you first put the dough in to start mixing. A lot of the flour will get stuck to the sides, which is why it is crucial to take it off and scrape down the sides. If you do not scrape down the sides and the bottom of the bowl, you will be left with a lot of flour sitting in the bowl when you go to start forming the rolls. And here you can see it turns into that ball where everything is mixing really nicely together. Just like before, the exact amount of grams that you have in your dough can be off slightly from other loaves that you have made before because you might put a little bit more or a little bit less water. It can be really difficult to get things like water and flour to the exact gram. So like I mentioned, I weigh out each one that I do and then just divide it by 6 so that I know I am getting the exact same size instead of just eyeballing it. If you feel like this step adds too much time, you could absolutely just grab a handful of it, turn it into your little ball, place it on your pan, and try to just make all 6 approximately the same size. Similarly to before, the dough should not be too sticky that you cannot work with it with your hands nice and oiled. You will make it into that nice flat shape and tuck all of the sides in and place it onto your parchment paper so that it does not get stuck to the pan while it is baking. Because I made these ones with my dill everything seasoning, I also topped them with the dill everything seasoning, and again pressed down ever so slightly, not to flatten out the buns and rolls, but to allow them to have it stuck in a little bit more so they won't go anywhere when they're baking. At this point, I tented the foil over top of this batch as well and then sat both of them to rest. I will typically sit them to rest 2 to 3 hours before baking. When it is ready to bake, I will put a pot of water into my oven and preheat the oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. The pot of water will create a nice steam in the oven, which will allow the bread to rise even more. And once it has reached its temperature, I place both of the sheet pans inside of the oven to bake. I will set the buns to bake covered for 40 minutes. After that initial 40 minutes covered, you will then remove the foil from both of the trays and return them to the oven at that 425 degrees to bake for another 30 minutes uncovered. I personally take this baking time as a great opportunity to get the rest of the meal started or the topping for whatever you want to put on these buns. When they are completely done baking after that final 30 minutes and you remove them from the oven, you will want to allow them to cool for about 20 minutes before you start serving on them. I usually remove mine and leave them sit on the tray, or I will remove them and put them onto a wire cooling rack. These are my finished sesame buns, and they are sitting, cooling, getting ready to eat. And then I have my finished everything dill buns as well. I'll cut those open and you can see here what the inside of it looks like. This is after you have let it sit to cool. When they first come out, if you cut into them right away, they will be too doughy because the inside has not set up yet. So here's the inside, nice and squishy and soft. Sometimes we will broil some cheese on top of them after we have cut them open, but then they are ready to serve and enjoy with whatever you are having for your meal that night. Thank you for following along. I hope this recipe makes a great addition to your family dinners, and be sure to like and comment so that you stay informed when I post any new gluten-free sourdough videos.